August 17th, 1943, 5:30 in the morning, Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea. The air inside the maintenance hangar hung thick with the smell of aviation fuel and tropical humidity. Technical Sergeant Jack Sullivan crouched beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning, his shoulder wedged against the aircraft's boom, his hands working in the narrow space where most men's hands couldn't reach. He was installing a piece of wire that could destroy his life. 6 inches long, bent into a Z shape with a pair of pliers, cut from a salvaged aircraft 2 weeks earlier. Sullivan forced the wire into the control cable system, his fingers slipping on the greasy metal, his breath coming short and fast in the confined space. The wire was not authorized, not approved, not in any manual or specification or engineering document in the entire United States Army Air Force. Installing it was a court-martial offense. But doing nothing meant Lieutenant Robert Hayes would probably die today. Just like the 17 other pilots Sullivan had watched climb into their P-38s over the past 6 weeks and never come back. Sullivan's thumb was bleeding. He had cut it on the wire 3 minutes ago, and the blood made everything slippery. He wiped his hand on his coveralls, leaving a dark smear, and kept working. Outside the hangar footsteps, the morning inspection crew arriving early, Sullivan froze, his heart hammered against his ribs. If they caught him now with the inspection panel off and the unauthorized modification half installed, he was done. Dishonorable discharge at minimum, prison time possibly. The footsteps came closer, paused at the hangar entrance. Sullivan held his breath. The wire tensioner was visible, sticking out from the cable junction like an accusation. No way to hide it, no way to explain it. The footsteps moved on, fading into the distance. Sullivan exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, though there was plenty of that. From the weight of what this moment meant. In 40 minutes, Hayes would climb into this aircraft, would taxi to the runway, would take off into a sky where 18 Japanese fighters waited to kill him. And the only thing standing between Hayes and a bullet through his cockpit was this piece of wire that Sullivan wasn't supposed to install. What Sullivan didn't know, what nobody in the entire Pacific Theater could have predicted, was that this modification would reverse the air war, would change how every P-38 Lightning flew, would save somewhere between 80 and 100 American lives over the next 4 months, and that his name would never appear in any official record of it. This is the story of how one mechanic saw what the engineers missed, how he broke every rule to fix what was broken, and how the man who saved those lives died unknown, unrecognized, and unrewarded for what he had done. But to understand why Sullivan was willing to risk everything on this humid August morning, you need to know what happened 2 months earlier, in June, when his world ended. Jack Sullivan was 28 years old in the summer of 1943. He came from Detroit, Michigan. His father had worked as a tool and die maker at the Ford Motor Company plant on the River Rouge. Every day after school, young Jack would go to the plant and watch his father work, watch him measure tolerances to the thousandth of an inch, watch him reject parts that met the specifications but weren't quite right. His father taught him to see what others couldn't see, to hear what others couldn't hear, to feel the difference between good enough and correct. It was a gift, a curse sometimes, but mostly a gift. By the time Sullivan was 20, he was one of the best mechanics in Detroit. He could diagnose an engine problem by the sound it made idling, could tell you which cylinder was misfiring, which valve was sticking, which bearing was wearing out, all by listening. People thought it was magic. Sullivan knew it was just attention, paying attention to the small things that everyone else ignored. But that gift couldn't save his younger brother. Danny Sullivan was 23, stationed in England with the 8th Air Force, waist gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress. The bomber crews called their aircraft flying coffins, sometimes a dark joke that wasn't entirely a joke. On June 8, 1943, Danny's bomber went down over Germany during a daylight raid on Bremen, all 10 crew members killed. The telegram arrived at the Sullivan house in Detroit 4 days later. Jack Sullivan read it standing in his mother's kitchen. The words didn't make sense at first. Missing in action, presumed dead. The Army regretted to inform them. He read it 3 times before the meaning penetrated. Danny was gone. 4 days after that, Sullivan's mother sent him a letter. She had been going through Danny's things, the belongings he had left at home, and found something Danny had written 3 weeks before he died. A letter Danny never sent, maybe meant to send, maybe just needed to write. In it, Danny described a problem with his gun turret. The mechanism that rotated the twin 50 caliber machine guns would stick sometimes, then release suddenly with a jerk that threw off his aim. He had reported it to his crew chief 3 times. The crew chief checked it each time, ran the turret through its full rotation. Everything worked fine during the checks. The problem was intermittent, only happened under certain conditions. Under combat stress, maybe, when the hydraulic fluid got hot, when the aircraft was maneuvering hard. The crew chief said it was within tolerance, nothing to worry about. All equipment had quirks. You learned to work around them. On June 8th, when the German fighters attacked Danny's gun turret, jammed at the critical moment. He couldn't rotate it to track the FW-190 coming in from the beam, Couldn't fire, couldn't defend his aircraft. The German fighters pressed their attack. The B-17 went down. Within tolerance, killed Danny Sullivan. Jack Sullivan requested a transfer to the Pacific Theater on June 20th. His commanding officer in Detroit asked him why. Sullivan said he wanted to do his part. The officer approved the transfer without further questions. Sullivan shipped out to New Guinea on July 1st, 1943, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group Maintenance Section, Dobodura Airfield. Working on P-38 Lightnings, he arrived carrying 2 duffel bags of personal belongings and a weight of grief and guilt that made it hard to breathe sometimes. He couldn't fix Danny's war. Danny's war was over, but he could fix this one. Could make sure no other mother received a telegram because some mechanic said a problem was within tolerance when it wasn't. What Sullivan didn't know was that he had just been assigned to an aircraft with a flaw that was killing American pilots at nearly 1 per day, a flaw that was technically, officially, by all engineering standards, within acceptable specifications. The P-38 Lightning was a beautiful aircraft, twin-engine, twin-boom design, fast in a straight line, devastating at high altitude. When American pilots could dictate the terms of engagement, when they could dive down from altitude at 400 miles per hour and blast a Japanese aircraft out of the sky before climbing back to safety, the P-38 was a killer. But when American pilots got caught in a turning fight with a Japanese Zero, they died. The Zero was lighter, more agile. It could execute a full horizontal turn in roughly half the time the P-38 needed. In a dogfight, that difference was everything. American doctrine was clear: never turn with a Zero, use speed, use altitude, dive and shoot, climb out, hit and run tactics only. But combat didn't follow doctrine. Combat was chaos. And in that chaos, American pilots kept getting caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. The training manual said it was pilot error. The instructors said these pilots weren't following doctrine. The after-action reports blamed poor judgment, inadequate training, failure to maintain situational awareness. But Sullivan, crouching under P-38 wings in the tropical heat of New Guinea, checking control cables and measuring tolerances, knew something the training manuals didn't. The P-38's aileron control cables ran through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward through a series of pulleys to the wing control surfaces. The cable system had slack in it, not much, a few hundredths of an inch at full deflection. The factory specifications allowed for up to 0.06 inches of slack. Every aircraft Sullivan checked measured somewhere between 0.05 and 0.06 inches, all within spec. But that tiny bit of slack created a delay between stick movement and aileron response. At high speeds, when the pilot threw the stick hard over and the aerodynamic forces were massive, it didn't matter much. The delay was imperceptible. But at low speeds during hard turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and getting shot down. Sullivan felt it the first time he tested the cables on his assigned aircraft, that little bit of give in the system. He pulled on the cable and felt it stretch slightly before the tension caught, 0.058 inches. Maybe a little less. He checked the specifications, 0.06 inches allowed. This cable measured 0.058 inches within specification. He signed off the maintenance log and moved on to the next aircraft. But the feeling stayed with him. Something wasn't right. He couldn't articulate it yet, couldn't prove it. But his hands knew, the same way his hands knew when an engine was running a degree too hot or a bearing was starting to wear. Something about those cables was wrong. Sullivan met Lieutenant David Murphy on his 3rd day at Dobodura. Murphy was 24 years old. Sacramento, California. His father owned an auto repair shop on J Street downtown. Murphy had grown up with grease under his fingernails and the smell of engine oil in his clothes, same as Sullivan. They bonded over that, over California, over the particular satisfaction of diagnosing a problem that everyone else had missed. Murphy had been in theater for 3 weeks when Sullivan arrived, 6 combat missions flown, 0 kills. Not because Murphy was a bad pilot, he was solid, competent, he followed the doctrine, stayed fast, stayed high, used hit-and-run tactics, but he couldn't seem to get a good shot. The Zeros were too quick, too agile. They'd see him coming and break away before he could line them up. On the morning of July 9th, Murphy found Sullivan doing the pre-flight inspection on his assigned P-38. "Sergeant," Murphy said, "can I ask you something?" Sullivan looked up from the engine cowling he was checking. "Sure, Lieutenant." Murphy made a gesture with his hands like he was working an invisible control stick. "Does this aircraft's controls feel delayed to you, like there's a gap between input and response?" Sullivan straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag. "Delayed how, sir?" "It's slight," Murphy said, "but it's there. Like the airplane thinks about what I want it to do for a split second before it does it. You know what I mean?" Sullivan knew exactly what he meant, but he said, "Let me check the cables, sir." He spent 20 minutes going through the control system, measured the cable tension at 3 different points, checked every pulley for wear or misalignment, tested the control surfaces for binding. Everything was perfect. Cable slack measured 0.058 inches. The specification allowed up to 0.06 inches within spec. Sullivan signed off the maintenance log. Everything checks out, sir. Should be good to go. Murphy nodded slowly. Probably just me getting used to the aircraft, different field than the trainers. Thanks, Sergeant. At 6:15 that morning, Murphy took off on a fighter sweep over Leh. Sullivan watched from the flight line as the P-38 climbed into the pale tropical sky, the twin Allison engines growling their distinctive sound. He went back to work on the next aircraft. 2 hours later, Murphy came back. Sullivan saw the P-38 in the landing pattern and felt relieved. One more pilot home safe. Then he saw the bullet holes. 3 of them. Tight group in the left boom, 20-millimeter cannon fire. If they had been 6 inches higher, they would have hit the cockpit. Sullivan examined them while Murphy was in debriefing. The holes told a story. This wasn't random spray and pray shooting. This was precise deflection fire. The Zero pilot had led Murphy perfectly, had calculated exactly where Murphy's aircraft would be, had put his rounds right there. That level of precision required the Zero pilot to predict Murphy's flight path, which required Murphy's aircraft to move predictably, which shouldn't have been possible if Murphy had rolled hard and dove immediately the way the doctrine said, unless there was a delay, unless Murphy moved the stick and the aircraft took a fraction of a second to respond, long enough for the Zero pilot to see the start of the maneuver, calculate the lead, and fire. Sullivan stared at those bullet holes for a long time. When the depot crew came to take the damaged aircraft for repairs, Sullivan watched them taxi it away. Watched Murphy walk to the ready room to fill out his after-action report. 3 weeks later, word came through the grapevine. Lieutenant David Murphy killed in action over Raboul. Different aircraft, same story. Caught in a turning fight, couldn't roll out fast enough. Sullivan attended the memorial service, stood in the back with the other enlisted men while the chaplain spoke about sacrifice and duty and the price of freedom, watched them fold Murphy's personal effects into a box to ship home to Sacramento. The official report called it pilot error, failure to follow doctrine, engaged in turning fight contrary to training. But Sullivan knew it wasn't pilot error. Murphy had tried to roll out, had moved the stick. The aircraft just hadn't responded fast enough. Within spec killed Murphy, same as it killed Danny. Captain William Morrison was everything a P-38 pilot should be, 35 years old, flight leader, 11 confirmed kills, 18 months in theater. Morrison had survived when dozens of others hadn't because he was smart, careful, never took unnecessary risks, never let emotion override judgment. Morrison's crew chief was a staff sergeant named Eddie Rodriguez, El Paso, Texas. Rodriguez maintained Morrison's aircraft with the same careful precision that Morrison flew it with. They had an understanding. Rodriguez kept the aircraft perfect. Morrison brought it back in one piece. Sullivan and Rodriguez became friends in those first weeks at Dobadura. They'd work side by side in the maintenance hangar in the evenings after the day's missions were done, tweaking and adjusting and making sure everything was exactly right for the next day. Rodriguez talked about Morrison the way you talk about someone you trust, absolutely. If anyone can survive in this aircraft, Rodriguez said one night, it's Morrison. He's the best pilot I've ever seen. Doesn't take chances, doesn't get rattled, just does the job and comes home. Sullivan believed it. Morrison looked like he'd lived through the war. On August 3rd, Morrison led his flight on an intercept mission. Intelligence said 8 Japanese Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay, heading south toward Allied positions. Morrison's flight bounced them from altitude. Perfect setup. Sun behind them. Speed advantage. Morrison called the brake and they dove. Morrison got the first Zero. A clean kill. Textbook deflection shot that sent the Zero down trailing smoke and fire. His 12th kill put him 2 away from ace status, but 2 more Zeros reversed on him. Morrison called it over the radio, said he was rolling inverted to split S away. Standard defensive maneuver. Should have worked. Sullivan was in the operations room when it happened. He wasn't supposed to be there. Enlisted men didn't usually hang around operations during missions, but he'd been delivering a parts requisition form and he heard Morrison's voice over the radio speaker. Rolling inverted, braking right, pause. Controls feel mushy, not responding fast enough. The tension in Morrison's voice was clear even through the static. Then gunfire. The rattling sound of cannon shells hitting aluminum. Morrison's wingman. He's hit. He's going down. More static. Then nothing. Morrison crashed at 4,000 feet. The jungle swallowed him. No parachute, no survivor radio beacon, no chance. The recovery crew found the wreckage 3 days later. Brought back what they could salvage. Rodriguez was waiting when they delivered it to the maintenance area. Sullivan helped him go through everything. They pulled the engines, checked the hydraulics, examined every control surface, measured every cable tension. Everything was perfect. Everything was within spec. Cable slack on the left aileron, 0.058 inches. Same as Murphy's aircraft. Same as every other P-38 on the line. The official report said pilot error. Failed to maintain airspeed in defensive maneuver. Allowed enemy to achieve firing solution. Rodriguez read the report and threw it across the maintenance hangar. It hit the far wall and fell to the floor. That's bullshit, Rodriguez said. His voice was quiet but hard. Morrison was the best pilot I ever worked with. He didn't fail to maintain airspeed. His aircraft failed him. Sullivan picked up the report, read it again, saw the words pilot error, and felt Danny's death all over again. The cables were within spec, Sullivan said. Then the spec is wrong. Sullivan looked at Rodriguez, saw his own frustration and grief reflected back. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Sullivan sat in the maintenance hangar with the maintenance logs spread out on a workbench, started going through them systematically. In the past 8 weeks, 37 P-38s had been lost in combat in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Sullivan pulled the reports for every loss where the wreckage had been recovered and inspected. 28 aircraft, he read every pilot report, every wingman testimony, every after-action summary. The pattern was there, clear as daylight once you knew to look for it. Slow control response, mushy controls, delayed roll, aircraft not responding fast enough, variations on the same theme in 28 out of 28 reports, and every single aircraft that had been checked post-crash showed cable tensions within specification. Sullivan showed Rodriguez the pattern the next evening. It's not the cables being out of spec, Sullivan said. It's the spec itself that's wrong. Rodriguez stared at the maintenance logs. So what are you going to do about it? Sullivan thought about Danny, about the gun turret that jammed, about the crew chief who said it was within tolerance, about the telegram his mother received. I don't know, Sullivan said, but I'm not going to watch this happen again. The next morning, Sullivan went to see Captain Richard Bradford. Bradford was the engineering officer at Dobadura, 32 years old, West Point graduate with an engineering degree from MIT, smart, competent, absolutely committed to following regulations. His office had a desk stacked with technical manuals, shelves lined with engineering textbooks, and his diploma from MIT hanging on the wall in a frame. Sullivan stood at attention and presented his findings, showed Bradford the pattern, 28 aircraft, all with pilot reports mentioning control delay, all with cables within spec. Bradford listened, leaned back in his chair when Sullivan finished, steepled his fingers. Sergeant Sal Bradford said factory specifications are determined by Lockheed engineers with advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering. They account for temperature variations, load factors, metal fatigue, a dozen other variables. If they say 0.06 inches of slack is acceptable, it's acceptable. Sir, with respect, Sullivan said, pilots are dying. Pilots are dying because combat flying is inherently dangerous. You're seeing correlation, not causation. When pilots are under extreme stress, they perceive delays that aren't actually there. It's called response lag bias. It's a documented psychological phenomenon. Sullivan tried again. But sir, if we could just tighten the cables a bit more than spec allows, maybe it would help. Bradford's voice was patient but firm. Sergeant, if you modify those cables beyond specification without authorization, you void the aircraft warranty. You violate federal regulations governing military equipment, and you personally could face court-martial. Do you understand the seriousness of what you're suggesting? Yes, sir. I'll submit an inquiry to Lockheed's engineering department, request their assessment of the cable tension specifications. We should receive a response in 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. In that time, how many more pilots would die because their controls responded a fraction of a second too slowly? Sullivan saluted and left. He understood now following the rules meant more pilots would die, but breaking the rules could destroy his military career and possibly land him in prison. The question Sullivan couldn't answer was which outcome he could live with. Between Murphy's death in July and mid-August, 5 more P-38s failed to return from combat missions. Each time Sullivan checked the maintenance logs, each time he found the same pattern: pilot reports of slow control response, cables tested within specification after the fact. Each time he brought the evidence to Captain Bradford. Each time Bradford told him to wait for Lockheed's engineering assessment. Sullivan started doing something that wasn't in any manual. He started testing cable tensions on every aircraft he worked on, not just his assigned ones, and he started listening to them. When you pluck a control cable, it makes a sound, like a guitar string. The pitch and resonance tell you about the tension. Tight cables have a clear, bright tone. Loose cables sound different. Lower pitch, duller resonance. Sullivan could hear the difference. Every P-38 on the line had cables that sounded loose to his trained ear, all within spec according to the measurements, but loose. He mentioned this to Rodriguez one evening. You're going to drive yourself crazy, Rodriguez said. Maybe, Sullivan admitted, but at least I won't be responsible for getting anyone else killed. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, what if there was a way to fix it unofficially? Sullivan looked at him. You mean modify the cables without authorization? I mean save lives. The authorization is just paperwork. Sullivan thought about that. About Danny and the gun turret that could have been fixed but wasn't, about Murphy and Morrison and the 5 others who had died in the past month. It would have to be something simple, Sullivan said slowly. Something that doesn't obviously look like a modification, something that could be installed quickly and removed quickly if necessary. You've been thinking about this, Rodriguez said. Every night since Morrison died. Lieutenant Thomas Parker was 21 years old. Born and raised in Boston, he had gone through flight training with Lieutenant Robert Hayes. They arrived in theater together, flew as wingmen, became best friends in that way young men do when they're far from home and facing death every day. Parker was scared. You could see it in his eyes every morning before a mission. The fear was right there on the surface. But he never talked about it, never complained, just climbed into his cockpit and did his job. Sullivan had worked on Parker's aircraft every morning for 2 months, had watched Parker walk out to the flight line with that fear in his eyes, had watched him come back when he came back with that fear still there but mixed with relief. On the morning of August 14th, Parker found Sullivan at the flight line at 6 o'clock. The sun was just starting to lighten the eastern sky. "Sergeant Sullivan," Parker said. His voice was quiet. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." Parker glanced around, made sure no one else was within earshot. "Is there anything you can do to make this aircraft roll faster? Anything at all? I don't care if it's regulation or not." Sullivan looked at Parker, really looked at him, saw a kid who knew his luck was running out, who had watched too many friends die, who was trying everything he could think of to survive one more day. "Officially, no, sir. The cables are within spec. There's nothing wrong with the aircraft according to the manual." What about unofficially? This was the line. Once Sullivan crossed it, there would be no going back. "Come back tomorrow morning, sir. Early. Let me think about it." Parker nodded, started to walk away, stopped, turned back. "Tomorrow might be too late, Sergeant. You understand that, right?" "I understand, sir." Parker walked away. Sullivan watched him go, watched him climb into his P-38 for the morning mission, watched him take off. That afternoon, Parker's flight encountered Japanese fighters over Finschhafen. Parker got separated from the formation during the initial engagement. 2 Zeros got on his tail. Sullivan was in the operations room again, delivering paperwork. He heard it happen in real time over the radio, Parker's voice tight with stress. "I can't shake them. Rolling right. Hayes, his wingman. Reverse, reverse back left. Parker, I'm trying. It's not responding fast enough." The fear in Parker's voice was naked now, raw terror. "Parker, they're on me. They're right on me." Gunfire, the sound clear even through the radio static. Parker screaming, "Hayes, Tommy, Tommy." Static, silence. Sullivan stood in the operations room, watched the operations officer mark Parker as missing, presumed killed, watched Hayes land an hour later alone, watched Hayes climb out of his cockpit and fall to his knees on the tarmac. That evening, Sullivan went to the maintenance hangar, pulled out a piece of piano wire he had salvaged from a P-38 that had ground looped 3 weeks earlier. The aircraft was scrap metal, but some of the parts were still good. He sat on the floor of the hangar with the wire and a pair of pliers, started bending it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, fought back against the pliers. Sullivan's hand slipped twice. The second time the wire cut his thumb, deep enough to bleed. He wiped the blood on his coveralls and kept working. It took him 8 minutes to get the shape right. The Z shape would act as an inline tensioner, would add just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack. He wrapped the tensioner in a cloth and put it in his tool bag. If Captain Bradford caught him installing this, Sullivan would face court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time possibly. But if he did nothing, Lieutenant Hayes would be next, and then someone else, and then someone else after that. Sullivan had made his decision. He would break the rules, would violate regulations, would risk everything because within spec was killing American pilots, and Sullivan would not let that stand, not anymore. Now he just needed Hayes to ask. The next evening, August 16th, Lieutenant Robert Hayes walked into the maintenance area. It was late, past 2200 hours. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. Hayes was 23 years old, farm kid from Iowa, had grown up driving tractors and fixing equipment and working dawn to dusk in the fields. 6 combat missions in theater, 0 kills. His best friend had died yesterday. Hayes found Sullivan working on an engine. Sullivan looked up when he heard footsteps. "Lieutenant Hayes, I'm sorry about Lieutenant Parker." Hayes nodded. His jaw was tight. His eyes were red. "Tommy died because his airplane didn't respond fast enough," Hayes said. "I heard him on the radio. I heard him trying. It wasn't his fault." Sullivan set down his wrench, said nothing. Hayes continued, "I've watched you work every morning for 2 months. I've seen you testing cables, listening to them. I know you see something wrong with these aircraft, something everyone else is missing." Sullivan remained quiet. "So I'm asking," Hayes said, "can you fix mine? I don't care if it's regulation. I don't care if it's authorized. I don't care about any of that. I just want a chance to come home alive." Sullivan looked at Hayes, saw Danny in him, saw Murphy, saw Morrison, saw Parker, saw every pilot who had died because the spec was wrong and no one would fix it. "Come back at 0530 tomorrow morning," Sullivan said, "before the inspection crew arrives. If anyone asks, you were never here." Hayes nodded once. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me yet, sir. This might not work. And if it doesn't, if the modification fails in flight, we're both finished. You understand that?" "I understand, but I'm already finished if nothing changes. At least this gives me a chance." Hayes turned to leave, stopped at the hangar door, looked back. "Sergeant, whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for trying." Hayes left. Sullivan stood alone in the maintenance hangar, looked at his tool bag where the piano wire tensioner waited, then he went to work. 11 o'clock at night, August 16th, 1943. The maintenance hangar at Dobodura was a cave of shadows and amber light. 2 overhead bulbs cast their weak glow across the concrete floor. Beyond the open hangar doors, the New Guinea night pressed close, thick with humidity and the buzz of insects. Sullivan stood alone beside P-38, Lightning number 42-12652, Lieutenant Hayes' assigned aircraft. The twin booms rose on either side of him like silent witnesses to what he was about to do. His tool bag sat on the wing. Inside it, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was the piano wire tensioner, 6 inches of bent steel that would either save a man's life or end Sullivan's career, maybe both. Sullivan pulled the inspection panel off the left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun, the heat radiating through his work gloves. He set the panel aside carefully, the screws placed in precise order so he could reassemble quickly if needed. Inside the boom, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. Sullivan played his flashlight beam along the cable path. Everything looked normal, clean, well-maintained, within spec. He reached in with both hands, grabbed the cable, pulled, felt the slack, 0.058 inches of play before the tension caught. His hands knew that feeling now, had felt it on dozens of aircraft over the past 6 weeks. Always the same, always that tiny bit of give in the system. The specifications said it was acceptable. The engineers at Lockheed said it was within tolerance. But Sullivan's hand said it was wrong, and 17 dead pilots said it was killing people. He pulled the piano wire tensioner from his tool bag, unwrapped it from the cloth. The metal gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, Z-shaped, crude-looking, nothing like the precision-engineered components that made up the P-38. But it would work. Sullivan knew it would work. Had tested the concept on a damaged aircraft 2 weeks ago, one that was headed for the scrap heap anyway. The tensioner eliminated the slack completely, made the control response immediate. The question was whether it would hold up under combat conditions, under the stress of violent maneuvers and high G-forces, whether the wire would slip or the connection would fail or some unanticipated problem would cause the whole system to jam. If it failed, Hayes would crash, and Sullivan would be responsible. Sullivan disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. The space inside the boom was tight, barely room for his hand and the flashlight. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure, the metal edge cutting into his arm through his coverall. He pulled out the clevis pin that held the cable to the pulley. The pin was stiff, didn't want to come out. Sullivan worked it back and forth, his fingers slipping on the greasy metal. The pin came free suddenly, dropped from his fingers. Sullivan heard it bounce. Once, twice, then nothing. He played the flashlight around inside the boom. The pin had fallen into the narrow space between the cable run and the boom structure. Somewhere in the shadows where the light couldn't reach, Sullivan's heart rate kicked up. He needed that pin. Without it, he couldn't reconnect the cable. Without the cable connected, the aircraft was grounded. And a grounded aircraft with a missing clevis pin would trigger an investigation that would lead straight back to him. He wedged himself further into the inspection opening, reached down into the boom with his right hand while holding the flashlight with his left. His fingers searched blindly, feeling for the pin. Nothing. He stretched further. The metal edge of the boom cut deeper into his shoulder. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the night air. His fingers touched something, the pin. He tried to grab it, but it rolled away from his touch. Outside, the hangar footsteps. Sullivan froze. Someone was walking past. Slow, measured steps. The night security patrol, probably. The footsteps came closer. Sullivan could see a flashlight beam sweeping across the ground outside the hangar entrance. If the guard looked inside, if he saw Sullivan half inside an aircraft boom with the inspection panel off, there would be questions. Questions Sullivan couldn't answer. The footsteps stopped. The flashlight beam played across the hangar entrance. Sullivan held absolutely still. His right arm was numb from the awkward position. His shoulder screamed where the metal edge pressed into it, but he didn't move. Didn't breathe. The flashlight beam swept across the interior of the hangar, touched the P-38's tail, started moving toward the fuselage, then stopped, swung away. The footsteps resumed, moving on, fading into the distance. Sullivan let out his breath slowly. His hands were shaking now. He forced them steady, reached back down into the boom, found the pin, grabbed it this time, held on tight. He pulled his arm out of the boom, sat back, looked at the clevis pin in his palm. Such a small thing, a piece of metal 1.5 inches long, but without it, nothing else mattered. Sullivan inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley. The fit was tight. He had to force the wire into position, bending it slightly to make it seat properly. When it was in place, he threaded the clevis pin through the cable eye and the pulley. The pin didn't want to go. The tolerances were too tight now with the tensioner adding bulk to the connection. Sullivan had to force it, push hard, use a screwdriver to tap it through the last 1/4 inch. When the pin finally seated, Sullivan tested the cable tension by hand, pulled on it, felt for slack, nothing. The cable was tight, no play at all. The control surface moved immediately when he applied pressure. Perfect. Sullivan replaced the inspection panel. His hands were steadier now. The hard part was done. He just had to finish reassembly and get out of the hangar before anyone else came by. He tightened the screws in their proper sequence, made sure everything looked exactly as it had before, wiped down the boom surface to remove fingerprints and smudges, cleaned up his tools, put the flashlight back in his bag, stood up and looked at the P-38. From the outside, nothing looked different. The aircraft appeared identical to every other Lightning on the line, but inside that left boom was a modification that had never been approved, never been tested, never been authorized by anyone with the authority to authorize it. Sullivan checked his watch, 1:15 in the morning. He picked up his tool bag and walked out of the hangar. The tropical night wrapped around him. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear aircraft engines. Japanese night raiders, probably. The sound made his stomach clench. He had just violated federal law, used non-standard parts, modified a flight critical system without authorization. If the modification failed during flight, if Hayes crashed because of what Sullivan had done, there would be an investigation. They would find the unauthorized tensioner. They would trace it back to Sullivan. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time. But if Sullivan had done nothing, Hayes would probably die anyway, just like Parker, just like Murphy, just like Morrison. At least this way Hayes had a chance. Sullivan went to his bunk, lay down fully clothed, stared at the ceiling, didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just watched the darkness and waited for dawn. At 5:30 in the morning, Sullivan was on the flight line, watching the fuel and armament crews prepare the aircraft for the day's missions, watching them service Hayes P-38. They didn't notice anything different. Why would they? The modification was hidden inside the boom, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. At 6:30, the pilots came out for their pre-flight briefings. Sullivan saw Hayes in the group. Hayes glanced toward the maintenance area, caught Sullivan's eye for just a second. Sullivan gave the slightest nod. Hayes's shoulders relaxed fractionally. Then he turned away and headed to the briefing room. At 7 o'clock, the pilots walked out to their aircraft. Hayes did his pre-flight walk around, checked the control surfaces, looked into the engine intakes, kicked the tires, all the normal routine. Sullivan watched every movement. His anxiety was a physical weight in his chest. Every time Hayes touched something, every time he checked something, Sullivan tensed, waiting for Hayes to notice something wrong, to see something out of place. But Hayes finished his walk around, climbed into the cockpit, strapped in. The ground crew pulled the wheel chocks. Hayes started the engines. The twin Allison Phi 1710s coughed, settled into their distinctive rumble. Hayes ran through his engine checks, oil pressure, coolant temperature. Magneto drop test, everything normal. Then the control surface check. Hayes worked the stick and rudder pedals. Sullivan watched the ailerons move, up and down, left and right, smooth, immediate, no hesitation. Hayes gave a thumbs up to the crew chief. The crew chief signaled all clear. At 7:42, Hayes taxied to the runway, 17 P-38s in formation. They lined up in pairs, ran up their engines one last time, then released brakes and rolled. Hayes's P-38 accelerated down Dobadura's pierced steel planking runway. The tail came up, the main gear lifted, the aircraft climbed into the morning sky. Sullivan watched until the formation disappeared to the northwest, toward Japanese-held territory, toward combat. Then all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 8:14. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Japanese Zeros at 13,000 feet over Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind the Americans. Perfect attack position, height advantage, speed advantage, everything by the book. Hayes was flying number 3 position in the second element. His element leader called out the bounce. 4 P-38s rolled inverted and dove. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the Japanese formation, pushed his throttles to full power, built speed to 380 miles per hour. The P-38's twin booms began to shake with the airspeed. The whole aircraft felt like it was trying to tear itself apart. The 0 grew larger in Hayes's gun sight. He could see details now. The painted rising sun on the fuselage, the greenhouse canopy, the pilot's head turning, spotting the attack, beginning to react. Hayes centered the pipper, pressed the trigger. 450 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon opened fire. The noise was enormous, even through Hayes's leather helmet. The whole aircraft shuddered with the recoil. Tracers reached out. Most of them missed. The deflection angle was wrong. A few rounds sparked off the Zero's wing. Minor hits, not enough to bring it down. The Zero snap rolled right and dove. Standard evasion. The Zero pilot was using his aircraft's superior roll rate to break away from the attack. In 3 seconds, he would be gone, diving toward the deck where the P-38 couldn't follow without risking compressibility problems. Hayes rolled to follow and felt something he had never felt before. The aircraft responded instantly. Not almost instantly, not quick enough, actually instantly. The stick moved in his hand and the P-38 snapped into the roll at the exact same moment. No delay, no lag, no fraction of a second gap between input and response. It was like the aircraft had been waiting for his command and executed it the instant he gave it. Hayes rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half his normal roll time, got his nose pointed down. The Zero was right there in his sight picture. The Japanese pilot had expected more time, had calculated his evasion based on the P-38's known roll rate, but this P-38 wasn't rolling at its known rate. Hayes pulled lead, fired, 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Hayes saw the impact sparkle along the green-painted metal, saw pieces fly off, saw the engine cowling disintegrate. The Zero's engine exploded, black smoke and orange flame. The aircraft rolled inverted and began to fall. trailing fire, out of control. Hayes' first kill. No time to think about it, no time to feel anything about it because his wingman was screaming on the radio that zeros high, 3 of them coming down fast. Hayes looked up through his canopy, saw them. 3 zeros in a shallow dive. They had been above the fight, had watched Hayes kill their squadron mate. Now they wanted revenge. Hayes shoved his throttles forward, started to climb, but the zeros were faster in the dive. Gravity and their lighter weight gave them the edge. They would be on him in seconds. Every instinct Hayes had, every hour of training, every briefing he had ever sat through, all of it screamed the same thing. Keep climbing, keep your speed up, don't turn, don't fight, run. That was the doctrine. That was what kept P-38 pilots alive. But Hayes had watched that doctrine kill Tommy Parker 3 days ago. Had heard Parker on the radio trying to follow doctrine while 2 zeros shot him out of the sky. The zeros were too close. Hayes couldn't outclimb them, couldn't outrun them. They would be in firing position in 5 seconds. Hayes made a decision that violated everything he had been taught. He rolled hard left and pulled. The P-38 snapped around. The nose came up through the horizon. The world rotated. Sky became ground, became sky again. The maneuver was violent. Hayes felt the G-forces slam him down into his seat. Felt his vision start to gray at the edges, but he kept pulling. The nose came through. Hayes saw the lead zero. The Japanese pilot was turning to follow Hayes' brake, but he hadn't expected Hayes to reverse that fast. The zero was exposed, out of position, not ready. Hayes pulled lead, fired, hit the zero in the left wing root. The wing folded up, snapped off at the spar. The zero tumbled, pieces flying everywhere. 2 kills in less than a minute. The other 2 zeros tried to scissors with Hayes. Alternating turns to force an overshoot. Classic zero tactic. It worked against P-38s because the Lightning couldn't match the zero's turn rate. The American would try to follow the turns, would fall behind, would have to break off or get shot. But Hayes' P-38 wasn't turning like a normal Lightning. Every time the zeros reversed direction, Hayes reversed with them. His aircraft snapped into the turns instantly. No delay, no lag. The response was immediate. It was like flying a different aircraft, like someone had removed weights that Hayes hadn't known were there. The P-38 did exactly what he wanted it to do at the exact moment he wanted it done. The zeros couldn't shake him, couldn't get outside his turn radius. They tried, reversed hard, reversed again, but Hayes stayed with them. One of the zero pilots made a mistake, reversed too hard, bled too much airspeed trying to get away. His aircraft slowed, began to wallow. Hayes was inside his turn radius now. Close range, maybe 200 feet, so close Hayes could see the Japanese pilot's face turning to look at him, could see the moment of realization in the other man's eyes. Hayes fired, couldn't miss at this range. The rounds tore the zero apart. The cockpit disintegrated. The fuselage broke in half. Pieces of aircraft tumbled past Hayes' canopy. He felt his P-38 shudder as debris impacted his right boom. 3 kills. The 4th zero broke off, rolled, inverted, and dove for the deck, running. Hayes thought about pursuing, but his fuel state was low, his ammunition nearly gone. And his right boom had taken damage. He needed to get home. Hayes climbed back to altitude, reformed with what was left of his flight. His element leader's voice came over the radio at Hayes confirmed 3 kills. Hayes couldn't quite believe it himself, but he said confirmed 3. The total engagement had lasted 7 minutes. Captain Frank Mitchell watched the entire fight from 15,000 feet. Mitchell was a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, 30 years old, 11 confirmed kills. He knew aircraft, knew their capabilities and limitations, knew what was possible and what wasn't, and what he had just watched shouldn't have been possible. Mitchell had been orbiting high cover when Hayes' element made their bounce. Had watched the fight develop below him, had seen Hayes get his first kill. That was normal. Good shooting, nothing unusual. But then Hayes' reversal, the way his P-38 had snapped around when the zeros attacked, that wasn't normal. That was impossibly fast for a Lightning. Mitchell knew P-38 performance, had been flying them for 8 months, knew their roll rate, their turn rate, their every characteristic. Hayes' aircraft had rolled faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen, had reversed directions that should take a P-38 3 or 4 seconds in less than 2, and then staying with the zeros and the scissors. That was impossible. Zeros could outturn P-38s all day long. It was their primary advantage. American pilots knew better than to try to turn with them, but Hayes had turned with them, had stayed inside their turns, had shot 2 of them down doing it. Mitchell keyed his radio. Davis, did you see Hayes' reversals down there? His wingman responded, yeah, that's not normal, is it? No, it's not. Mitchell watched Hayes reform with his element and head back toward Dobodura, watched the way Hayes' aircraft maneuvered. It looked different, moved different, responded different. Something had changed. Mitchell didn't know what, but he was going to find out. After landing, Mitchell didn't go to debriefing immediately. He went looking for Hayes, found him in the ready room. Hayes was sitting in a chair still in his flight gear, hands shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off now. The reality of what had happened settling in. 3 kills on 1 mission. Hayes had gone from 0 to 3 in 7 minutes. Mitchell walked over. Lieutenant Hayes, congratulations on your kills. Hayes looked up, saw the captain's rank, stood. Thank you, sir. That was some impressive flying out there, especially your reversals. I've never seen a P-38 move like that. Hayes' expression became guarded. Just following my training, sir. No. Mitchell's voice was gentle but firm. Your aircraft performed differently than any Lightning I've ever seen. What changed? Hayes was silent for a moment. Mitchell could see him thinking, weighing his options. Finally, Hayes said, "You should talk to Technical Sergeant Sullivan, sir, the maintenance chief." Why? Because he's the one who can answer your questions. But, sir, if you're going to talk to him, you should know he might not want to discuss it officially. Mitchell understood. Unauthorized modification, off the books, against regulations. The question was whether to report it or investigate it. Mitchell thought about the 4 pilots he had lost from his flight in the past month. All of them caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. All of them dead because their aircraft couldn't respond fast enough. "Where can I find Sergeant Sullivan?" Mitchell asked. 2 hours later, Captain Mitchell walked into the maintenance area. He found Sullivan working on a different P-38, hands black with grease, coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and oil, just another mechanic doing his job. Technical Sergeant Sullivan looked up, saw the captain's rank insignia, came to attention. "Sir?" "At ease, Sergeant." Mitchell paused, then said, "I want to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer." Sullivan's face was carefully neutral. "Yes, sir." "What did you do to Lieutenant Hayes' airplane?" Sullivan could have lied, could have denied everything. Could have said he didn't know what the captain was talking about, but something in Mitchell's eyes made him tell the truth. "Everything's within spec, sir." "I didn't ask if it was within spec. I asked what you did." They looked at each other for a long moment, Sullivan making a calculation, deciding whether to trust this officer or not. Sullivan told him about the cable slack, about the pilots dying, about the piano wire tensioner, about the unauthorized modification that eliminated the delay in control response. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When Sullivan finished, Mitchell asked one question. "Can you do the same thing to my aircraft?" Sullivan stared at him. "Sir, I've lost 4 pilots from my flight in the past month, all of them caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there's something that can help my pilots survive, I want it. The regulations can wait." "Sir, you understand the risks. This isn't approved, isn't tested. If something goes wrong in flight, if the modification fails, the pilot crashes, and we both face court-martial. If my pilots don't make it back from the next mission, court-martial doesn't matter. Can you do it or not?" Sullivan nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, but if this goes wrong, we're both finished." "I understand. When can you start?" "Tonight, sir. 2200 hours. Come to the hangar alone." Mitchell extended his hand. Sullivan shook it. A pact made. An agreement to break regulations together in order to save lives. "Thank you, Sergeant," Mitchell said. "Don't thank me yet, sir." Mitchell flew his modified aircraft the next morning, August 18th, fighter sweep over Leh, 2-hour mission. When he landed and shut down the engines, Mitchell was grinning. He climbed out of the cockpit, walked straight to his wingman, Lieutenant Carl Jensen. "The aircraft rolls like a fighter instead of a truck," Mitchell told him. Jensen looked confused. "Sir." "Get maintenance to check your control cables. Ask for Sergeant Sullivan specifically. Tell him I sent you." That afternoon, Jensen found Sullivan in the maintenance area. "Sergeant Captain Mitchell said you could help with my aircraft." Sullivan was cautious now. The secret was spreading faster than he had anticipated. What kind of help, sir?" "The kind that makes it roll faster. I don't care how. I just want it done." Sullivan looked at Jensen's face, saw determination, saw a pilot who wanted to survive. "Come back at 2200, sir. If anyone asks where you were tonight, what will you say? I was in my bunk sleeping. I was never here." By August 20th, Sullivan had modified 9 aircraft. The word spread through the squadron like fire through dry grass, whispered conversations in the ready room, quiet requests in the maintenance area, pilot to pilot, friend to friend. Some pilots heard about it and said nothing, weren't ready to trust unauthorized modifications, preferred to stick with the known quantity, even if the known quantity was getting people killed. But others came to Sullivan, asked for the modification, were willing to take the risk. Sullivan started teaching the technique to other crew chiefs. Rodriguez was first, then Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston, then others. The modification itself was simple once you knew how to do it. Find a piece of piano wire from a salvaged aircraft, cut it to 6 inches, bend it into a Z shape with pliers, install it as an inline tensioner in the aileron control cable system. Takes 8 minutes if you know what you're doing. Changes everything. Rodriguez did his first installation on August 21st. His assigned pilot was Lieutenant Sam Perkins. Perkins flew the modified aircraft the next day, got 2 kills, his first kills after 8 weeks of combat missions with nothing to show for it. Rodriguez was convinced, started teaching the modification to other mechanics in his section. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien was skeptical at first, didn't like breaking regulations, didn't like the idea of unauthorized modifications, but he had watched too many pilots die, had signed off too many maintenance logs on aircraft that came back shot full of holes or didn't come back at all. O'Brien tried the modification on one aircraft. The pilot came back raving about the improved handling, got his first kill in 6 weeks. O'Brien stopped being skeptical, started installing tensioners. By early September, 43 P-38s in New Guinea had the modification, concentrated mostly in the 49th and 475th Fighter Groups, some in the 8th. The modifications spread quietly, no official documentation. No engineering approval, no authorization from anyone with the authority to authorize, just mechanics and pilots conspiring together to fix what was broken, to save lives, to hell with regulations. And the statistics started to change. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed. The kill ratio was 0.5 to 1, losing badly. In August, it improved to 1.3 to 1, still losing, but not as badly. By early September, it was nearly 1 to 1, breaking even. Someone looking at the statistics would see a clear trend. Something had changed in August. Something was making American P-38s more effective in combat. But what Captain Bradford started noticing in early September, he reviewed the combat reports as part of his duties as engineering officer, saw the kill ratios improving, saw American pilots surviving engagements they should have lost, winning fights that should have gone the other way. But there were no official changes, no new tactics, no upgraded equipment, nothing in the paperwork that explained the improved performance. Bradford pulled maintenance logs. Everything looked normal. Random aircraft inspections showed all systems within specification, nothing out of the ordinary, but something bothered him, something he couldn't articulate, a feeling that something was happening outside his view. On September 2nd, Bradford watched the morning inspection routine, stood off to the side, and observed the mechanics going through their pre-flight checks. They seemed rushed, nervous maybe, or was he imagining it? The next morning, September 3rd, Bradford arrived at the flight line 15 minutes early, unannounced, wanted to see the routine before the mechanics knew he was watching. He saw Sullivan and 2 other mechanics working quickly on 3 different aircraft, saw Sullivan pull an inspection panel, reach inside, a boom remove, something pocket it. Bradford walked over. "Sergeant Sullivan, what was that?" Sullivan turned. His face was calm, neutral. "Just checking cable routing, sir." "Show me what's in your pocket." Sullivan reached into his pocket, pulled out a clevis pin, held it up. "Damaged clevis pin, sir, was about to replace it." Bradford looked at the pin, looked at Sullivan. Something was wrong here. He could feel it, but he had no proof. "I'm ordering a surprise inspection for September 5th, Bradford said. 0515 hours before your normal pre-flight routine. I want to see these aircraft exactly as they are." Sullivan's expression didn't change. "Yes, sir." Bradford walked away, but he knew something was being hidden from him, and he was going to find out what. That night, Sullivan gathered every crew chief who had installed the modification, 10 men, all of them facing the same choice now. "Bradford knows something's going on," Sullivan said. "He's ordered an early inspection in 2 days. If we don't remove the tensioners before then, he'll find them, and we're all finished." Staff Sergeant William Foster spoke up. He was young, 22. "By the book. Then we should remove them. Confess before we get caught. Take whatever punishment comes." Sullivan looked at him. "You want to remove them, fine. But understand what that means. It means going back to watching pilots die because their controls don't respond fast enough. It means more telegrams sent home, more memorial services. You ready for that?" Foster's voice shook. "I'm ready to follow the regulations I swore to uphold." The room was silent. Every man there understanding the choice: follow regulations and watch more pilots die, or keep breaking the rules and risk court-martial. September 4th, 1943, 8 o'clock in the morning. Staff Sergeant William Foster stood outside Captain Bradford's office door. His hand was raised to knock. Had been raised for 30 seconds, but he couldn't make himself do it. Foster was 22 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania where people followed rules, where your word was your bond and regulations meant something. He had joined the Army because he believed in duty and honor and doing things the right way, and now he was about to betray 10 men who had trusted him. But what choice did he have? They were breaking federal law, violating regulations that existed for good reasons. If one of those modifications failed in flight, a pilot would die, and Foster would be responsible. Better to confess now, take the punishment, do the right thing. Foster knocked. Bradford's voice came through the door. "Enter." Foster walked in, stood at attention. Bradford looked up from the paperwork on his desk. "Sergeant Foster, what can I do for you?" Foster's mouth was dry. "Sir, I need to report a violation of regulations." "Multiple violations, sir." Bradford set down his pen, leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." Foster told him everything: the piano wire tensioners, Sullivan's design, the unauthorized modifications on 43 aircraft, the conspiracy of silence among the mechanics and pilots. Bradford listened without interrupting. His face showed nothing. When Foster finished, Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Sergeant. You're dismissed." "And Foster, don't discuss this conversation with anyone. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Foster left, walked back to the maintenance area, feeling sick to his stomach. He had done the right thing, followed regulations, maintained his integrity, so why did it feel like he had just signed the death warrants of men who were trying to save lives? Bradford sat alone in his office, stared at the wall. He wasn't surprised, had suspected something like this for weeks. The improved kill ratios, the combat reports describing P-38s maneuvering in ways they shouldn't be able to, the nervous energy among the mechanics during inspections. Now he knew what it was. An enlisted sergeant had designed and installed unauthorized modifications on 43 aircraft, had violated regulations, had used non-standard parts, had altered flight critical systems without engineering approval. By every rule Bradford had been taught at West Point and MIT, this was unacceptable. Sullivan and everyone who helped him should face court-martial. But Bradford kept thinking about the statistics, the kill ratios that had improved dramatically starting in August, the pilots who were coming home alive when they should have been killed. The question wasn't whether the modification worked. The statistics proved it worked. The question was what mattered more, following regulations or saving lives. Bradford made a decision. He would catch them with evidence, force everything into the open, and then decide what to do about it. September 5th, 5:15 in the morning. Bradford arrived at the flight line with two other engineering officers, Lieutenant Morrison and Lieutenant Chen, both good men, both by the book. The maintenance area was quiet. The mechanics hadn't started their normal pre-flight routine yet. Some of the aircraft still had the tensioners installed from the previous day's flying. Bradford's team moved quickly, pulled inspection panels on 6 randomly selected aircraft. First aircraft, Bradford played his flashlight beam along the cable run inside the boom, saw the piano wire tensioner immediately, Z-shaped piece of wire inserted between the cable and pulley. "What is this?" Bradford asked the maintenance chief standing nearby. The maintenance chief said nothing. Second aircraft, same modification. Third aircraft, fourth, fifth, sixth, all of them, every single aircraft they checked had the unauthorized tensioner installed. Bradford's voice was cold. "I want every crew chief who worked on these aircraft lined up right now." 10 minutes later, Sullivan and 9 other mechanics stood at attention in front of the hangar. Bradford paced in front of them. His anger was controlled, precise, the anger of a man who had been lied to for weeks. "Gentlemen," Bradford said, "you have installed unauthorized modifications on 43 aircraft in direct violation of federal regulations, Army Air Force directives, and manufacturer specifications. You have used non-standard parts. You have altered flight control systems without engineering approval. Any one of you could face court-martial and dishonorable discharge." He stopped pacing, looked at each man in turn. "But before I make that decision, I want to know one thing. Why? Not why did you follow orders? I know Sergeant Sullivan led this. Why did each of you choose to break regulations you swore to uphold?" Silence. The mechanic stared straight ahead. Nobody spoke. Then Rodriguez stepped forward. "Permission to speak, sir." "Granted." Rodriguez's voice was steady, but Captain Morrison was the best pilot I ever worked with, sir. His aircraft was within spec when he died. Within spec wasn't good enough, sir. O'Brien spoke next. "I watched Lieutenant Murphy die, sir. His cables were within spec too." Another mechanic. "My pilot had 0 kills in 6 weeks, sir. Now he has 7. I'm not sorry for what I did." Sullivan stepped forward. "Sir, this is my responsibility. I discovered the problem. I designed the modification. I taught these men how to install it. If you're going to court-martial anyone, court-martial me. Leave them out of it." Bradford stared at Sullivan, saw a man who was willing to sacrifice his career to protect others, who had seen a problem and fixed it even though fixing it could destroy him. Bradford thought about Morrison, about Murphy, about the 37 pilots lost before August, about the improved statistics since. He thought about his MIT education, about engineering principles and safety factors and why regulations existed, and he thought about 17-year-old kids climbing into aircraft that didn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. "Remove all modifications immediately," Bradford ordered. "Ground all affected aircraft until I complete a full investigation. Sergeant Sullivan, you are confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings." The mechanics looked devastated. Sullivan's face showed nothing. Bradford turned and walked away, left them standing there. Within an hour, word spread through the squadrons. The modifications had been discovered. The aircraft were being grounded. Sullivan was facing court-martial. 18 pilots showed up at Bradford's office. They didn't ask permission, didn't wait to be invited, just walked in. Captain Mitchell was their spokesman. Hayes stood beside him, Jensen, Perkins, others. "Sir C. Mitchell said, we need those modifications reinstated." Bradford looked at the group of pilots crowding his small office. "They're unauthorized and unsafe." Hayes stepped forward. His voice shook with anger. "Unsafe, I'm alive because of that modification, sir. I'd be dead like Parker if my cables were within spec. Tommy Parker died because his aircraft didn't respond fast enough. I didn't die because mine did. That modification saved my life." One by one, the other pilots spoke, described how the aircraft handled before and after, the kills they had achieved, the confidence they now had in combat. Mitchell's voice was calm but firm. Sir, with all respect, the modification works. Our survival rates prove it. If you ground these aircraft, you're sentencing pilots to death. Bradford held up his hand. I understand your feelings, gentlemen, but regulations exist for reasons. If that modification fails in flight, the aircraft crashes. I cannot authorize untested changes to flight critical systems based on anecdotal evidence. Then test it, Mitchell said. Bring in engineers, run flight tests, do whatever you need to do, but don't ground us while you debate theory. We're fighting a war out there. Bradford looked at these pilots, young men who flew into combat every day, knowing they might not come back, who had found something that gave them a better chance of survival, and now he was taking it away because the paperwork wasn't in order. I'll consider your input, Bradford said. You're dismissed. The pilots left. Bradford sat alone in his office, picked up his phone, called 5th Air Force headquarters, asked to speak to the operations officer, started to request an urgent engineering evaluation from Lockheed, then stopped, put down the phone, thought about Morrison, about the official report that blamed pilot error when the real problem was a specification that allowed too much cable slack, thought about Sullivan, an enlisted mechanic who saw what the MIT-trained engineers had missed. Thought about the 37 pilots who had died before August, and the dramatically improved survival rates since. Bradford picked up the phone again, called for Sergeant Sullivan. Sullivan entered Bradford's office 20 minutes later, still in his work coveralls, still covered in grease, stood at attention. Sergeant, sit down. Sullivan sat, waited. Bradford was quiet for a moment, then said, The Lockheed engineers would tell me your modification is safe and effective if I asked them to evaluate it. They would also tell me it's technically unauthorized and violates multiple regulations. Sullivan said nothing. But Lockheed is 7,000 miles away in California, Bradford continued, and pilots are dying here, today, right now. Bradford leaned forward, looked Sullivan directly in the eyes. So I'm going to do something that goes against every principle I was taught at West Point and MIT. I'm going to trust the judgment of an enlisted mechanic over the regulations written by engineers with advanced degrees. Sullivan couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Reinstall the modifications, Bradford said. All aircraft, you will train every crew chief on proper installation technique. You will personally inspect every installation. If one modification fails and a pilot crashes because of it, I will court-martial you myself and make sure you spend the rest of this war in a military prison. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Bradford stood, extended his hand. Sullivan stood and shook it. For what it's worth, Sergeant, I should have listened to you in July. Captain Morrison might still be alive if I had. I won't make that mistake again. Sullivan's throat was tight. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just make damn sure those modifications don't fail, because if they do, we're both finished. I won't let you down, sir. Sullivan left Bradford's office feeling like he could breathe again. The weight that had been crushing his chest for the past 24 hours was gone. He went back to the maintenance area, found Rodriguez and the others waiting. We're reinstalling everything, Sullivan said. Bradford approved it. Rodriguez stared at him. He approved it, said to reinstall all the modifications, train everyone on proper technique, make sure they're done right. The mechanics erupted in celebration, slapping each other on the back, laughing with relief. But Sullivan was already thinking ahead, thinking about quality control, about standardizing the installation, about making sure every single modification was perfect. Because if even one failed, Bradford would keep his promise, and Sullivan would spend the rest of the war in prison. September 27th, all 43 aircraft had the tensioners reinstalled. Sullivan had personally inspected each one, had established strict standards for installation, had trained every crew chief on the proper technique. Word spread to other fighter groups. The 8th Fighter Group at Goosap requested Sullivan visit and train their mechanics. Sullivan traveled there, spent 3 days teaching the modification. By mid-October, 120 P-38s in the Southwest Pacific had the modification, and the kill ratios kept improving. But something else was happening, something Sullivan didn't know about yet, something happening on the other side of the war. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's most skilled fighter pilots. 64 confirmed kills. He had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor, had survived Midway Guadalcanal Rabaul, had seen aircraft and tactics change, had adapted and survived when many others hadn't. In late August, Sakai started reading combat reports from other Japanese pilots, reports that mentioned American P-38s maneuvering differently, rolling faster, reversing more quickly. Tactics that had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Sakai was analytical, methodical. He knew that individual pilot skill didn't improve this quickly across an entire unit. If multiple pilots were reporting the same changes, something mechanical had changed in the American aircraft. On September 3rd, Sakai led a flight of 6 Zeros on a fighter sweep, intercepted 4 P-38s over Wewak. Sakai dove on the trailing P-38, used his standard tactic, drew the American into a turning engagement, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his zero, back the opposite direction to get inside the American's turn radius. It was a maneuver Sakai had executed dozens of times. He knew the timing perfectly, knew exactly how long a P-38 took to roll, knew when to reverse to achieve the perfect firing position, except the P-38 rolled faster than it should have. Sakai's timing was off. The lead angle he had calculated was wrong. His burst missed completely. The American got guns on him. Sakai had to dive away, use his speed to escape. He returned to base, frustrated and confused, wrote a detailed report for intelligence. American P-38s have mechanical modification affecting control response, source unknown, effect negates our maneuverability advantage, recommend tactical revision. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They needed hard evidence. Within a week, recovery teams in Japanese-held territory had located wreckage from 3 downed P-38s shot down in early September. On September 10th, a team of Japanese technical officers assembled at a makeshift examination facility near Wewak. The 3 wrecked P-38s lay spread across the jungle clearing. All had been shot down within the past week. All showed significant combat damage, but portions of the airframes were intact enough to examine. Lieutenant Yoshida headed the technical team. He was 29. Had studied aeronautical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University before the war. Had examined dozens of captured American aircraft. Knew P-38s well. Focus on the control systems, Yoshida ordered his team. Flight surfaces, cable runs, hydraulics. Something changed, find it. The team worked methodically, pulled inspection panels, traced cable paths, measured components. In the second aircraft, a technician found something, called Yoshida over. Lieutenant, look at this. Inside the left boom, where the aileron control cable connected to the pulley junction, was a Z-shaped piece of wire, 6 inches long, installed between the cable end and the pulley. Yoshida examined it carefully. The wire appeared to be piano wire, high tensile strength. The Z shape created an inline tensioner that would add preload to the cable. Check the other aircraft, Yoshida said, see if they have the same component. The team found identical tensioners in all 3 wrecks. Same design. Same placement, same installation method. Yoshida photographed the components, made detailed measurements, sketched the installation, then made his critical mistake. This appears to be standard American equipment, he wrote in his report. All 3 aircraft examined show identical tensioning devices installed in the aileron control cables. Conclusion, this is original factory equipment, not a field modification. The Americans have improved their cable tensioning system in production. The report went up the chain to Naval Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka. Engineers there reviewed Yoshida's findings. They had no reason to question his conclusion. Why would they? The tensioners looked professional, were installed consistently, appeared to be production components. The Japanese never realized they were looking at field modifications, never understood that what they had found was unauthorized, never grasped that the change wasn't from Lockheed's engineers in California, but from a mechanic in New Guinea working alone at night. Based on Yoshida's report, Japanese engineering officers made their own mistake. They examined zero control systems, wondered if their own aircraft needed similar tensioning improvements, spent weeks testing and modifying zero cable systems that didn't need modification. The Zero's cables were already tight. The aircraft didn't have the slack problem that plagued the P-38. All that effort, all that analysis, chasing a solution to a problem they didn't have, while missing the real story entirely. By late September, Japanese command issued new orders based on combat reports and the failure to understand what had actually changed. Avoid engagement with P-38 formations unless numerical superiority is at least 2-1. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted, all because of a 6-inch piece of piano wire that nobody in Tokyo understood. December 1943, Sullivan was in the mess hall reading a newsletter from Army headquarters when he saw the announcement. Lockheed was introducing the P-38J Lightning, new production model, improved performance, enhanced maneuverability, key feature, improved control cable tensioning system. Sullivan read the article twice, looked at the technical description. It was his design. The piano wire tensioner, modified slightly, manufactured properly, but fundamentally the same concept. He showed Rodriguez. They're using your modification, Rodriguez said. Did they credit you? Sullivan read through the entire article. No mention of field modifications, no mention of New Guinea, no mention of his name, just developed by Lockheed engineering team. Rodriguez was furious. That's theft. You should report it. Tell them it was your design. Sullivan shook his head. Who would believe me, an enlisted mechanic claiming he invented something Lockheed engineers couldn't figure out? It's the truth. Truth doesn't matter when you're going against Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. In January 1944, a Lockheed engineer returned to Dobodura, asked to meet with Sullivan, brought legal paperwork, a non-disclosure agreement. Sullivan was required to sign it, agree not to discuss the modification publicly, agree not to claim credit, agree not to seek patents or compensation. In exchange for his agreement, nothing, no money, no recognition, no credit. The engineer tried to explain, this protects Lockheed from liability. If the modification is officially a field improvisation, families of pilots killed in unmodified aircraft could sue. By making it our design, we control the legal exposure. Sullivan read the document, thought about refusing, but the Army could order him to sign it, could make his life miserable if he didn't cooperate. He signed. After the engineer left, Rodriguez exploded. They stole your innovation, your design, and you're just letting them. Sullivan looked at the P-38s on the flight line. The P-38J will have properly manufactured tensioners on every aircraft. That's more important than my name in a report. That's bullshit. Maybe it was. But Sullivan thought about Danny, about how his brother had died anonymously defending a bomber that fell from the sky, how no one remembered the name of the waist gunner who couldn't rotate his jammed turret. Maybe anonymity ran in the Sullivan family. Foster never spoke to Sullivan again after the confession. The other mechanics knew what he had done. Word spread quietly. Foster requested transfer to a different unit in October 1943. The request was approved. He spent the rest of the war maintaining aircraft at a rear area depot in Australia, away from combat, away from the men he had betrayed. He went home in 1946 and never talked about his service. The weight of what he had done followed him the rest of his life. Robert Hayes survived the war, flew 63 combat missions total, 11 confirmed kills, returned to Iowa in September 1945, married his high school sweetheart Betty 2 months later, had 4 children, worked as a crop duster for 37 years, and every August 17th he called Jack Sullivan. The first call came in 1946. Hayes had tracked down Sullivan's number through veteran registries, called on a Tuesday afternoon. "Is this Jack Sullivan?" "Speaking." "This is Bob Hayes. You worked on my P-38 in New Guinea." Sullivan remembered. "Lieutenant Hayes, you got 3 kills that first day. I'm calling because I wanted to say thank you. You saved my life. I'm home. I'm getting married next month. I have a future because of what you did." Sullivan didn't know what to say. Finally managed, "You did the flying. But you made the airplane work. I just wanted you to know I'm alive. And I'll never forget what you did." That became a tradition. Every August 17th for the next 57 years, Hayes called Sullivan. Sometimes the calls were brief. Just a voice saying, "I'm still here, still alive, still grateful," sometimes longer. Hayes telling stories about his farm, his kids, his life. In 1950, "My first daughter was born last month, Catherine Ann. I thought you should know. She exists because you installed that wire in my aircraft." In 1963. "Kathy graduated high school today, top of her class. When I watched her walk across that stage, I thought about you, about that night you broke the rules to save my life." In 1977. "Kathy got married last weekend. I walked her down the aisle, and all I could think was that none of this would exist if you hadn't done what you did." In 1988, "My first grandchild was born. James Robert Hayes. We call him Jimmy. The James is partly for you. Betty suggested it." For Hayes, these calls were a reminder. A debt acknowledged but never fully repaid. For Sullivan, they were proof that one life saved ripples forward through time, through generations. Sullivan never married, lived alone in a small house near his garage in Long Beach, worked 6 days a week fixing cars. Sundays he read, worked on projects, remembered. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he said he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes, that's all. He kept one photograph, himself standing next to a P-38 in New Guinea, August 1943, never displayed it, kept it in a desk drawer. His customers didn't know the man fixing their engine had changed the Pacific War. They saw a quiet mechanic who did good work, who charged fair prices, who could diagnose problems by listening to an engine idle. They didn't know he was listening the same way he used to listen to control cables, hearing what others couldn't hear. Every August 17th, Sullivan blocked out his afternoon, waited for Hayes's call. It was the only day he talked about the war. In 1991, a military historian named Dr. Robert Chen was researching P-38 modifications for his dissertation at Stanford, found a pattern in maintenance logs from New Guinea, cable tension modifications. August and September 1943, dozens of aircraft, one name appearing most frequently, Technical Sergeant J. Sullivan. Chen cross-referenced with Lockheed's development timeline, field modification in August, factory adoption in December. The timing was suspicious. Chen tracked Sullivan down, called him, asked to meet. They met at Sullivan's garage in Long Beach. Sullivan was 73, still working part-time, hands permanently stained with decades of engine grease. Chen brought a recorder, asked about the modifications. Sullivan confirmed the story but deflected credit. Chen showed Sullivan his analysis. "Based on survival rate improvements in modified versus unmodified aircraft, I estimate your innovation saved between 80 and 100 American pilots." Sullivan was quiet for a long time, stared at his hands. I know the names of four, Sullivan finally said. Hayes, Mitchell, Jensen, Perkins. The rest are just numbers to me. They were real people, Chen said gently, with families, children, grandchildren, all alive because of what you did. Sullivan looked at the photograph on his desk, the P-38, New Guinea, a lifetime ago. I think about the ones who didn't make it more than the ones who did. Murphy, Morrison, Parker. If I'd figured it out sooner, maybe they'd have come home too. August 12th, 2003. Sullivan's phone rang, 5 days early. Jack, it's Bob. Sullivan checked the calendar. You're early. It's not the 17th yet. Hayes' voice was weak, labored breathing. I know, but I probably won't make it to the 17th this year. Cancer, lungs. Doctor says maybe a week. Sullivan's throat constricted. I'm sorry, Bob. Don't be. I'm 83. I've had 60 years I wasn't supposed to have. 60 years because of you. Silence. Both men understanding this was the last call. Hayes continued, his voice stronger now, determined to get through this. Jack, I need you to understand something. Every single morning for 60 years when I woke up, my first thought was the same. I'm alive because of Jack Sullivan. I watched my kids grow up, walked my daughters down the aisle, held my grandchildren, watched the sun rise on my farm 22,000 times. None of that should have happened. I should have died over New Guinea in August 1943, but I didn't because you cared enough to break the rules. Sullivan was crying, first time since Danny's death. Bob, I don't know what to say. Say you'll remember me, always. Thank you, Jack, for everything, for my life, for my family, for all of it. I'll see you on the other side, you and Danny and Parker and all of them. Take care, Bob. You too, Jack. And thank you. One last time. Thank you. Hayes died 3 days later. At his funeral, his family told the story about Sullivan, about the modification, about how one mechanic's courage saved their father. At Hayes's desk, his son found a box. Inside were maintenance logs, every single one Sullivan had signed for Hayes Aircraft. 63 missions, saved for 60 years. The last entry read, Aircraft 42-12652, left aileron cable tension adjusted, airframe serviceable. Technical Sergeant J. Sullivan, August 16th, 1943. Hayes's son sent the box to Sullivan. When Sullivan opened it, saw his own handwriting from 1943, he finally broke down completely. Jack Sullivan lived 3 more years after Hayes' death. Worked in his garage until he was 86. His hands never stopped knowing the feel of metal, the sound of engines, the difference between right and wrong. He thought about Hayes often in those final years, thought about the life that had continued because of one night's work. 4 children, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren by 2006. All of them existing because Sullivan had refused to accept that within spec was good enough. He thought about Danny too, about the telegram, about his mother's face when she read it, about the gun turret that jammed. In his final weeks, Sullivan would sit in his garage office and look at that photograph, himself at 28, standing beside a P-38 in the New Guinea heat, young, determined, carrying grief he didn't know how to name. He wondered sometimes if he had done enough, if he had moved fast enough, if Murphy and Morrison and Parker would have lived if he had figured it out sooner. But then he would think about the calls from Hayes, about the 73-year-old man whose voice still shook with gratitude, about the generations that existed because one mechanic saw what the engineers had missed. Jack Sullivan died June 3rd, 2006, age 88. Heart failure, quick and painless. He was buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in California on a Thursday morning. 16 people attended, some former mechanics, some children of pilots he had worked with. Dr. Chen came from Stanford. His obituary in the Long Beach Press-Telegram mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. One paragraph. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner, did not mention changing how American fighters flew, did not mention the 80 to 100 lives saved. His grave marker shows his name dates and the words U.S. Army Air Force. Nothing about what he did. Sullivan's Auto Repair still stands in Long Beach today. Different owner, different name. But in the back office, there's a faded photograph on the wall, a young mechanic in coveralls standing next to a P-38 Lightning. Date on the back, August 1943, New Guinea. The current owner doesn't know who the man was, but something about the photograph felt important, so he kept it. That's how real innovation happens in war. Not through official channels, not through engineering committees, through mechanics who see problems, who find solutions, who don't wait for permission to save lives. Through pilots who trust them, through officers who eventually listen. Jack Sullivan changed the Pacific War with 6 inches of piano wire and 8 minutes of unauthorized work. His name appears on no monuments, no medals, no official histories. But somewhere today, a great-grandchild of Robert Hayes is alive, going to school, playing with friends, living a life that wouldn't exist without Sullivan. That life exists because, on a humid August night in 1943, a grieving mechanic decided that within spec wasn't good enough, because Jack Sullivan understood what his brother Danny had learned. Sometimes regulations kill people. people. Sometimes following orders means watching people die. Sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody remembers. But we remember today. We remember Jack Sullivan. We remember that the best solutions often come from the people closest to the problem. We remember that courage isn't always about combat. Sometimes it's about doing what's right when everyone says you're wrong. We remember that recognition isn't the point. The point is the pilots who came home, the families who didn't receive telegrams, the generations who exist because one man refused to accept that within tolerance was good enough. If this story moved you, share it. Someone needs to hear about Jack Sullivan, about seeing clearly, thinking independently, acting courageously. And if you served or your family served or you've known someone who did the right thing without asking permission, leave a comment. Tell their story because these stories matter. These people matter. Even if history forgot their names, we won't. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.